Okay, good afternoon. Welcome. I'm just trying to put this into presentation mode. Here we go. Okay, so good afternoon to everybody. Ami Bojo, Gizis Kwedejnakas Makodorem, Bigit Tagong Nishnabek and Dunjba. So it is a really great pleasure to be here today and to welcome you all to this very special panel on Unsettling Geography, Opportunities and Challenges for Engagement in Indigenization. So we have a very exciting panel for you all today. Before we get into the panel, I want to make a very, an acknowledgement of the lands that I'm standing on. So I'm in the Geography Department, the Geography and Environment, Department of Geography and Environment here in London, Ontario. But long before London was here, long before Western was here, this river that you see on the screen was here. This is Dept. This is the river that runs through the heart of our territory and connects all of the communities that we work with, that we're honored to work with. So these are the Haudenosaunee people, the Anishinaabe people, the Lenni Lenape people, and the Attawandaron people. And I think that as we sit and stand in this place today, we honor the people who've been here before us. We honor all of the relations who, you know, we embrace in our day-to-day, and we're always thinking, of course, about the people who've yet to come. And I think as geographers, this is one thing that we do really well together, is that we're thinking about, you know, preserving the nature of this place for generations to come. So it is really a great pleasure to be here. I just wanted to offer a bit of, I guess, a bit of a roadmap for today. I'm going to provide just a very quick set of remarks about my own journey into geography as an Indigenous person. And we're then going to have, I think, two really amazing sessions. First, we're going to hear about some original research that Heather Castleden and Isaac White completed with chairs of geography departments across the country. And then we're going to hear some perspectives and insights from perspectives of Indigenous faculty, well, an Indigenous faculty member and an Indigenous student. And this should actually say it's a conversation with Diana Lewis and Victoria Bombery. And then we'll have about 15 minutes for some concluding remarks and questions from the audience. So, I begin, I guess, these introductory remarks by sharing my lake, the greatest of the lakes, which is Lake Superior, otherwise known as Gitchigami. And this is the place that I come from. So I grew up in this amazingly beautiful place that that claims me still, and was nurtured by, loved by, cared for by people who did amazing things to bring me into this world and make it a beautiful place for me. And I spent my first 19 years in this place and experienced a lot as a Native person growing up, an Anishinaabe person growing up in Northern Ontario, who did not know necessarily that many of the experiences I had were not the same experiences that many other Canadians were having. And it was really coming into my training in geography at McMaster University. Woo, give a little shout out to McMaster, where my eyes were opened, not necessarily about the role for Indigenous people in geography, but about the ways that geography opens our eyes to the interconnections of the natural world, of the social world. And it was in this place where I began to learn about inequities and challenges in environments faced by many people across the world. And as I thought about experiences that I had, you know, in spite of the beauty and the family and the love, there was also a lot of trauma, and there was a lot of disconnection. And I had just accepted that as a reality of my life. But my eyes were opened. And I know that in the past, I would say 4 months in Canada, many of our eyes have been opened like never before, with the recognition and the discovery of children's graves in Kamloops and now across the nation. We're in a time where we need to start acknowledging, reconciling, thinking really earnestly about how, as geographers, we are going to become a place of belonging for all people, so that we can, I think, use our skills, our perspectives, our knowledge to address some of the most pressing inequities in Canada. And so it's a big challenge, right? There are a lot of, I think, there's a lot of beauty in the work. It's deeply relational. We're in the very beginnings of this work, but I think we know a lot. And I think that this panel today is one that is going to, I think, build on a lot of the conversations that are happening and send us further. So it's really a great pleasure. Oh my goodness. So of course I put this, I did not mean to make this, what's happening here? Of course I added, I don't even know how to do this, to add these, I don't know why this is happening, I'm sorry. Where's the next slide? Yes, okay, so what we're going to hear next from, or who we're gonna hear from first, is Heather Castleden from the University of Victoria and Isaac White from Queen's University. And they're gonna share with us some research that they've been doing, I think over probably the past 18 months with chairs from geography departments. And so just very quickly before I pass it over, Heather Castleden is a dear friend and I think a really wonderful and much loved geographer. She's broadly trained, community engaged geographer and educator. She spent decades doing participatory research with Indigenous peoples across the country on priorities that align with her scholarly and applied expertise in environment, health, social justice, and decolonization. She's a very wonderful allied scholar who's written extensively on the need for collaborative participatory relationships as the basis for research at the intersection of Indigenous health and the environment. And currently, Heather is professor and impact chair in transformative governance for planetary health. So we're really happy to have you, Heather. Thank you for joining us from Pacific Standard Time. And joining her is Isaac. Isaac is a white settler scholar and member of the Health, Environments, and Communities Research Lab at the University of Victoria, which is headed by President. Isaac recently completed his Master of Arts in Cultural Studies at Queen's, where he explored the extent to which geography departments at Canadian universities are addressing the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action and how they are going about doing so. And so I'm really pleased to stop sharing my screen and my unintended delay there and allow them to speak on their research. So welcome to you both, and thank you very much for being here today.
Thanks, Chantelle.
Thank you, Chantelle. It's a real pleasure to be here and to hear those kind, loving words of introduction, and the connection that you have to that beautiful lake was really, really heartfelt. And yeah, so we're going to be talking, I still see your screen, Chantelle. I'm not sure if anybody else is still, but if we can, I'm going to share my screen in a moment. There we go. So let me see if I can share effectively and play from start. So just give me a thumbs up that you can see that, folks. My screen, yeah, we've got it. Okay, great. So yeah, I'm zooming in from the beautiful Lekwungen speaking territories of the Wasanich, the Esquimalt, and the Songhees nations on the southern tip of Vancouver Island. And I'm now a prof at the University of Victoria. This research is work that I've done with Isaac when I was still at Queen's University in the Department of Geography and Planning. And I guess what I wanted to say in relation to what I heard you say, Chantelle, is that part of the reason that I do this work, that I've been doing this kind of work for the last 20 years in the way that Chantelle described, is because of how strongly I feel about the importance of truth-telling in the context of our relationships with each other, particularly the way settler colonialism works in insidious and horrific ways in our discipline and more broadly across this land of Turtle Island. And I think about it because 20 minutes ago, I was in a research team meeting with folks that have invited me into their community for the last 16 years, Huu-ay-aht First Nations. And our advisory committee meeting was about treaty implementation. But unexpectedly, it was also about residential schools and about the Port Alberni residential school. And why is it that we haven't heard yet about the work that needs to be done in that school? And I put that in awful scare quotes, about the fact that there will be children found there. We know it. And that came out in the context of a meeting that didn't have anything to do specifically, directly, explicitly with residential schools. But this is part of our lived reality, whether we have been personally impacted by the residential schools, if you are Indigenous with your families, but also Canadians across the country. Apologies for any dog sounds you hear, but I am at home and the dog is shaking. So I just wanted to say that, and that's where there's a call to action for me to engage in geographies of truth and reconciliation in all of the work that I do. So what I'm talking about today, and I'm just going to give a quick overview of how this project came into being, and then I get to turn it over to Isaac, who is sort of the what do we call it, the brains behind all of this, because he spent his last year and a half looking at the data very, very closely and has done a marvelous job. So it's been a real pleasure to work with Isaac and to be on this panel with, two of my best friends, Chantelle and Dee. So there's an impetus for disciplinary critique that I got on. I guess, it's one of those bees in my bonnet of like, hey, there was a TRC in 2015. There were so many instances of universities saying, we need to do something, let's hire Indigenous people. That can be our response to the TRC. But I started to, 3 or 4 years in, go like, where is the actual action? There were 94 calls to action. What are we actually doing individually and in departments, in our faculties and institutions to actually take on with real teeth, not just declarations, but actual action around the TRC? And so at first it was in my public health hat, where I was jointly appointed at Queen's, that I was like, there's not enough happening here. There never will be enough, but there's certainly not even the baseline of enough. And so it prompted me to do a study that looks at how are public health graduate training programs doing in the context of responding to the TRC. And so that research was completed with a couple of Masters of Public Health students, Jylin and Maddie Derrick, and we published a paper in the Canadian Journal of Public Health. And our key findings were that, hey, everybody thinks the TRC is important, but there was a really uneven landscape for how things were happening across the country. For the most part, we were seeing some positive change, but that professoriate primarily needs to educate themselves, and yet not all are seeing the need to do so, which I find baffling for a public health discipline. Many were deflecting responsibility in this regard, and yet there's a desire, particularly around the next generation of students, who are trying to unsettle their own curriculum and calling to action their professors. So we felt, you know, what we were seeing is what we call an invasion to doing anything, because they're saying that, well, we don't have expertise, we have a desire to do something, but we don't want to burden our colleagues, and yet they're still not taking up that burden themselves, right? So our findings in that case were a call to action in the public health sector. But of course, as a geographer, which is near and dear to my heart, I really wanted to then look at and go, well, we must be doing better in geography, right? And I feel that in many ways, when I compare data sets, I think we are doing better, but we're still not doing enough. And you'll hear more about that from Isaac. But as you know, geography is all about, you know, mapping and understanding the world around us and the world beyond where we're from, in the context of the imperial expansion. And that what we see is a real significant role that geography has played and continues to play in many ways about maintaining the colonial expansion and seeing that embedded in Indigenous dispossession and genocide, white settler supremacy, and justified occupation on stolen lands. And that applies in university context too. And it's not that this is a relationship in the past. We're still seeing geography implicated in ongoing white settler colonialism. And how it plays out today is through institutional policies and protocols, as well as what we teach, how we produce and share geographical knowledge, and how we practice in this area. And I'm sure as well, being that, you know, most of us are geographers, we're familiar, I hope, with this interactive map to learn about the traditional territories here across Turtle Island. If you're not familiar with it, check out this website. It's a really good entry point to understanding whose land you are on, if it's not your own land. And so we have an opportunity here where we can say, okay, it's been just over 5 years since the TRC came out. We can maintain the way we're doing things, business as usual, or we can really transform the way we do things in our discipline. And I think in that context, the goal of my original research was to look at how are geography departments operationalizing the calls to action. And one of the things that we are thinking about in this work is the awesome writing that Adam Gaudry and Danielle Lorenz did in 2018. They talk about 3 different types of indigenizing and decolonizing in the academy. And I sort of mentioned one, this notion of inclusion. And so that's where we see, let's increase our numbers, but let's not change anything else. That's the inclusion sort of approach. The second approach would be reconciliation indigenization. And that's where you're saying, okay, actually Indigenous, you meaning the academy, the white academy, because that's largely what it is, are seeing that, that Indigenous perspectives, knowledge are absolutely fundamental to what needs to be in the academy. So let's make space. That's sort of the reconciliation approach. And then decolonial indigenization is actually a wholesale overhaul of the academy, where we're fundamentally changing how we recognize knowledge production and transforming the academy into something dynamic and new. A really good example of that would be for the Deshinta Bush University up in the Northwest Territories is an example of decolonial indigenization. And they've formed relationships with 3 other universities. They're part of the University of the Arctic, et cetera. And it's land-based learning. And I think about geography and I think, isn't that what we should be doing? So I'm just putting that out there. But I get ahead of myself. In order to understand what departments are doing, through a course that I developed and worked with students through a teaching and learning and research opportunity, I sent out invitations to the 50 geography department heads at Canadian universities right at the beginning of COVID-19 in February of 2020 here in the country. Those 50 invitations were based on what was on the CAG website that lists all of those who affiliate with the CAG. In that first round of invitations, we had 21 participants who agreed to have an interview with us. 9 declined and 23 did not respond. And as is protocol in doing this kind of recruitment strategy, we try again with those who didn't respond. And in trying again, we got 2 additional participants and 21 did not respond. So we had about a 50% response rate, and that's actually really quite good. It might not seem like it's enough, but it is actually a pretty robust response rate. We cannot really hazard a guess as to why 21 never responded, other than to say COVID was happening, and that was pretty chaotic. So the fact that we got a 50% response rate is pretty huge. During that time, it indicates that it's obviously important to those department heads. It may also be a signal that it may not be as important. And we'll get to that notion of time in a moment when Isaac talks about our findings. And we used semi-structured interviews. We had about 15 people, I would say, doing, maybe not 15, maybe 12 people doing interviews because it was part of a class-based research project. But what we needed was somebody who could take the data and really work with it extensively over the last year and a half or so that we've had the data. And that's where Isaac stepped in and agreed to take on that responsibility. And I'm so glad he did. I'm going to turn it over to you now, Isaac, to share how you approached your analysis and our key findings. Thanks.
Thank you, Heather. So we used Foucauldian discourse analysis to analyze the interview transcripts, and FDA is recognized as an interpretive approach to identify sets of ideas or discourses used to make sense of the world within particular social or temporal contexts. Doing FDA is not about unveiling what is and is not true, but rather revealing the structures of power or social processes that shape, authorize, and govern what counts as truth, who can speak truth, and how truth sanctions particular conditions or normalizing actions within a given society or culture. So we use a 2-staged analytical process. We did this to organize and analyze the data. In total, we ended up going through the transcripts 4 times. And in doing this, we developed a set of analytical codes, which include settler colonialism, neoliberal academy, willful settler ignorance, and upholding the status quo. So, sorry, one back, Heather. Yeah, I think, there we go, thanks. So there are 6 key themes of the research. These themes are influenced by the Foucauldian discourse analysis, what participants said and how it was said, as well as the literature that I engaged with throughout the research. So I'll speak to each of these themes individually now. Number 1 is we have a responsibility. So geography department heads clearly stated that they have a responsibility to operationalize the calls to action. And as participants acknowledge responsibility, some also noted the unique position of the discipline to address the issue. For example, some participants made comments about the discipline's colonial culpability and the implication of particular geographical practices like cartography and GIS in Indigenous dispossession and erasure. Number 2 is implementation takes time. So while participants recognized that not much had been done in their respective units, some also underscored that reconciliation and implementing the calls to action requires time. The notion that reconciliation is an ongoing process that necessitates time is accurate. However, some participants commented that time raises an issue or barrier to make changes that engage the TRC's recommendations. Ultimately, whether it was implicit or explicit in participant discussions, insufficient time was identified as a key barrier for many with respect to addressing the discipline's culpability and ability to self-correct when it comes to operationalizing the calls to action. And 3, the TRC is not my area of expertise. So there was substantial dialogue surrounding incapacity that extends to contexts where participants justified their insufficient action due to their academic backgrounds. So as participants discussed the challenging relationship between their individual research backgrounds and operationalizing the calls to action, some also outlined the ways in which the responsibility of implementing the calls should lie with the human geographers or social scientists in their units. And in many cases, we saw participant evasions and multiple ways of deflecting responsibility from the physical geography and natural sciences domains. And finding 4, individual faculty have academic freedom. So while some participants claimed how their research background produces barriers to transform curricula and implement Indigenous perspectives and knowledge systems, others noted the extent to which academic freedom engenders additional challenges to put the TRC's recommendations into practice. So in particular, some participants emphasized that academic freedom raises barriers over the implementation of desired changes within their units. In other words, participants highlighted that academic freedom either has or will potentially be used as a tactic to circumvent responsibility and time required to institute changes that engage the calls to action. Finding 5, we have capacity issues and a packed curriculum. So while time was overtly named as an impediment or constraint to implement the calls to action for some participants, others furthered the dialogue surrounding capacity issues, particularly with respect to making course and curriculum changes. So in discussing capacity, some participants noted that department size, i.e. small department, produces challenges to make curriculum changes that engage the calls. And as participants made comments about the relationship between department size and epistemological incapacity, some also drew attention to whether or not there is a faculty-wide will to implement Indigenous knowledges and perspectives. And as evidenced by participant comments, it appears that the challenge to change curricula in ways that engage the calls to action is influenced by epistemological incapacity, the duty to maintain the existing status quo geography curricula, and essentially insufficient time. And finally, as geographers, we know the land is a key site for geographical learning. So although participants made comments about capacity issues regarding academic freedom, department size, individual research background, and the ostensible nature of human versus physical geography, some shared successes of implementing course and curriculum changes that address the TRC's recommendations, in particular land-based learning. So in some cases, participants discussed that there have or will soon be efforts to develop field trips, field courses, and/or field schools that engage Indigenous knowledge systems, practices, and doings on and in relation to the land. So given the 6 key themes, Heather and I have put together 7 modest suggestions for strategically moving forward. The first being annual strategic reflection, planning, and implementation retreats. The second, peer-to-peer mentorship amongst faculty members. The third, strategic Indigenous guided curriculum review. The fourth, commitment to inviting Indigenous speakers. The fifth, mandatory training workshops on Indigenous approaches to pedagogy and assessment, followed by financial, institutional, and curricular support for land-based learning, and finally, indigenizing the department. So while department heads acknowledge responsibility, the findings show the degree of inadequacy concerning direct action, systematic and structured effort, and time committed to reconciliation at the department level. And it has been, well, now it's been, more than 5 years since the 94 calls to action were released. And the findings show that for the most part, Canadian geography departments have been minimally or superficially engaged with the calls over the past 5 years. So bearing this in mind, this research that Heather and I have done is a call to action. We're calling on geography departments to do better and to take the time away from their status quo agendas to strategically implement the calls to action, decolonize the discipline, and reconcile their relationships to Indigenous peoples in the land.
So that essentially wraps up the ideas that we wanted to share with you today. I know we're not going to take any Q&A right now. I just wanted to say that we went through that really fast. We are working on seeing a paper come out of this. We want to thank all of the department heads for agreeing to participate in this research, that we're able to do so, and to thank CAGONT organizers for reaching out to us to ask if we'd share our talk here with you today. I guess I wanted to just end on one point and then turn it back over to our moderator, Chantelle, and that's to say that for this idea of taking time away from your status quo agendas means literally in a department meeting, instead of, going through your business as usual, having dialogue and decision-making and action towards some of the suggestions that we've put forward, as well as the many others that are out there well beyond our research, coming from Indigenous scholars, Indigenous leaders, activists, governments, community members, about how we can do better. And that the next time somebody asks about this, that the first answer shouldn't be, I don't have time for it. Because it's all about, we have choices on how we spend our time, and it's the choices that matter, that help determine whether we're evading or acting in solidarity with Indigenous peoples in this country. And with that, thanks, Isaac. I know you had to blast through that.
Yeah.
we're done, and over to you, Chantelle.
Okay. Thank you both very much. That was great. You definitely blasted through. But I think you've raised a lot of really important points for our next. Of course, I'm trying to do two things at once. Am I sharing my screen? Yes. Is it in presentation? No. Okay. We are coming. Oh, goodness sakes. Okay. Me and my unintentional. Okay. So I think that this first presentation has been really wonderful for highlighting some of the very exciting movement that we're making, recognition, direction, but also really important challenges and the tensions that get put on Indigenous scholars who are coming into this space and may sometimes feel the weight, the weight of the work. And so what we wanted to do collectively in the next section of this panel is to hear from the perspectives of Indigenous scholars and trainees, Indigenous scholars themselves about how we're navigating this time. And so it's really a great pleasure. I cannot see Diana. Are you there, Dee? Oh,
yep.
There you are. Okay. So it's really a great pleasure to introduce both Diana Lewis and Victoria Bombery. And I'll start by reading Dee's bio. So Diana, otherwise known as Dee, Dr. Diana Lewis is co-director of A Shared Future, which is Achieving Strength, Health, and Autonomy through Renewable Energy Development for the Future, which is an international research program exploring how Indigenous knowledge systems, as applied to renewable energy development, may have the potential to lead us towards healthful environments through reconciling and healing our relations with each other, as well as with the land, air, and water around us. So Diana is also an assistant professor here in the Department of Geography and in Indigenous Studies. And she's a wonderful scholar whose long-term research interests are to foster a wider understanding of the unique aspects of Indigenous environmental health, specifically as it is impacted by resource or industrial development. Her future research will focus on developing an Indigenous-based human health risk assessment framework. A very, very big welcome to you, Dee. And also it is my pleasure to introduce Victoria Bombery, who's actually one of my master's students. So Victoria is a Mohawk Bear Clan from the Six Nations of the Grand River. She earned her honors Bachelor of Science in Geography and Environmental Sciences at McMaster University. And she is now in her second year of the master's program here at Western, where she sits in the Indigenous Health Lab with my other trainees. Victoria's research examines the influence of housing on the decisions of Indigenous peoples to pursue and complete post-secondary studies. So through her research, Victoria will examine the housing experience and needs of Indigenous students at Western. She's also the Indigenous Commissioner for the Society of Graduate Students at Western, and in this role, she works with Indigenous campus and community partners to support and enrich the Indigenous graduate student experience at Western. So it's really a pleasure to have you both here. And I thought what we would do in this session, and for some reason, the way that I am, I'm not able to see you two. So this is confusing to me. Are we having technical problems, or is it just me? Oh, there you two are. Okay. You're both pinned up here. Okay, great. Okay, I can see you now. I scrolled down, somehow I lost you two. So I'm really happy that you're here with me. Thank you. Being a moderator is a challenging job, just so you all know. Okay, so in our discussions in the past several years, I would say, and recently just pointed out to us through the research that that Heather and Isaac showed, we know that Indigenization matters for everyone. And it's not just for Indigenous peoples, and that we need to be prepared to do the learning. I wondered if one of you, maybe I'll ask Dee, can you comment on this idea or this concept?
Sure. I'm going to just thank you in my own language. Walaliak dan bet gimiak and walaliak dan deli bechidayak. Deleawi sabeganegadig. So I've just thanked you, Chantelle, for inviting me, and thank everybody for coming. I'm from Sabeganagadig First Nation in Mi'kma'ki, which you know as the Atlantic provinces. So I think about situations that I confront, Chantelle, are in conferences where I'm talking about the work that I do, and I'm talking about the work that I did with Pictou Landing First Nation in Nova Scotia about understanding importance of connection to place. And when I talk about it in the Mi'kmaq language that reflects like all of these understandings that Western scholars have of epistemology and ontology, we have all those things in our worldview as well. And when I explain it, I think it's very clear, but then the audience, somebody in the audience will say, well, help me understand this, help me understand. And so what I've taken to saying to people is, it's not my responsibility to help you understand, it's your responsibility to learn. And I remember the first time that I said it, a lady in the audience said she was so offended that I said that to them. She said, but when I sat and thought about it, you're right. And so I think like that's a good example of, you know, it's just so much pressure and burden on Indigenous people to always have to do the explaining. So I think what we're encouraging is for people now to take responsibility for their own learning process. Thanks, Chantelle.
Thank you very much. I think that also touches on the ways that the work extends beyond the boundary of our professional lives and adds this can add an emotional labor to the work that we do, because it doesn't necessarily stop when we check out at 4:30. I'd really love to pose this to you as well, Victoria.
Thanks, Chantelle. Thank you for that lovely opening and introduction. So yeah, I'll share my thoughts as a first-generation graduate student, but also someone who's done quite a bit of community research and planning for urban Indigenous communities. In that Indigenization matters for everyone because it expands our understanding around, for us as geographers, it can expand our understanding of many of the key issues facing facing all of us, but especially our society. And when one of the things that comes to mind is climate change and Indigenous understandings, Indigenous peoples and Indigenous communities experiencing climate change, not recently, but for several years and over generations, our communities have been feeling the impacts of climate change and have been raising the alarms to climate change to society at large, but very little of it has reached us, has reached the mainstream media. And so when we see these big international conversations happening right now with COP26, that Indigenous knowledges and the incredible stewardship that our communities are doing on the land and adapting and mitigating climate change at the local level that can inform a lot of these international movements, how much better our policies and our practices will be once we recognize that Indigenous knowledges have not only been missing from the academy, missing from geography, but they've been intentionally excluded, they've been intentionally erased, and they've been intentionally devalued. And that requires us to, as Dee mentioned, to take on the learning and to listen to those voices, not only listen to those voices, but seek out those voices in our research and our scholarship.
Mm-hmm. I think this builds an important, this next question or this next idea builds in important ways on that, in that address the Indigenous inequities. So if we're thinking about the biggest challenges out there, it requires many people, many knowledges, and significantly many more resources than are currently available. Do you want to maybe build on what you've just been talking about to address this question, Victoria?
In a roundabout way, yeah. I think what this question, when Chantelle and I were talking about it earlier, reminded me of my journey to the academy, and that as a mature student, my path to graduate studies was not straight. It was a bit of a roundabout way that I ended up back here. But when I talk about my research and my personal experiences, it was the intentional investment of Indigenous studies, Indigenous student centers, Indigenous studies programs that is actively recruiting and seeking out ways to support new Indigenous scholars, obviously of all ages. And Chantelle in particular, you know, the resources that the Indigenous Health Lab had to provide a free workshop where I first met Chantelle and the team that opened the door to graduate studies, opened the door a little bit wider. I also had a number of opportunities through the investments of the McMaster Indigenous Research Institute, where the monies that are invested in Indigenous knowledges on campus, Indigenous leadership are doing these incredible recruitment efforts, not only directly speaking to Indigenous students saying, hey, you should come work here, but providing opportunities to say, these are the amazing opportunities that you can pursue here. This is the research that we do that can benefit you as a scholar, but also your communities. So those intentional investments matter.
Thank you very much. Did you want to comment on this topic, this idea, Dee?
So what I would add from my experience is the case of Pictou Landing First Nation, where we have a community who has been asking for their health to be studied because of 50 years of being exposed to effluent and emissions from a pulp and paper mill. And Heather and I worked together on that starting in 2010 when we started to meet with the community. And Heather put together this large interdisciplinary team that was able to bring all of their expertise to start to assist the community. And the inequity that the community was experiencing was not just like the physical, mental, emotional, spiritual aspects of the health impacts, but they were experiencing impacts to their identity. Everything that made them Mi'kmaq people was under attack. And to be able to articulate that in a way, using our own knowledge systems and in our own words, help that community and will help other Indigenous communities advance that understanding.
You must be reading my mind because the next slide is about Indigenous knowledge. And I'm going to ask you, Dee, if you can talk about this idea that engaging with Indigenous knowledge is a right and a responsibility. And I think it's not for everybody, right? And you don't have to answer the yes or no, but I think this idea that, you know, it is a privilege to work with Indigenous knowledge.
It is a privilege to work with Indigenous knowledge, and it's a responsibility that I carry as a Mi'kmaq person to be able to not compromise that knowledge to get other people to a level of understanding. And so when I first started working on my PhD, and I realized that I had to use Indigenous knowledge in my research, I met up with resistance. And thank goodness I had people around me that could support me and encourage me to stay the path, because, you know, you face a lot of well, it's not hostility, but it comes across as hostility. You know, when I was told not to use Indigenous knowledge because the audience would think it was mumbo jumbo. Like, to use those words to frame Indigenous knowledge is so offensive and could have derailed me in my PhD studies. Like, that is how viciously it hit me. And so I carry that experience around with me, and I dig into it to make sure that I am honorable to our knowledge systems.
Thank you very much, Dee. Did you want to add to that, Victoria?
Yeah, just very briefly that the experience Dee is sharing with us, I think many of us Indigenous scholars and Indigenous students have felt more than once during our studies, more than once during our research, from different points in the academy, and that it has derailed some of our brightest scholars and taken them away from the academy when they had every right to be here and to use the Indigenous knowledges of their community. And that, I think, is where the responsibility of the academy comes in, to make sure that there is safe space for Indigenous scholarship, Indigenous knowledges to not only be in these spaces, but to flourish in these spaces. And, I think we see the academy starting to understand that responsibility when we look at the wording of Western's land acknowledgement, that they have a responsibility to Indigenous peoples to address the miseducation of Canadians. And that in part is ensuring that there's space for Indigenous knowledges on campus, not only for Indigenous students, scholars to engage with, but also allied scholars to respectfully engage with Indigenous knowledges as well.
I'm very thankful to you both for that. And I think that as, now that I've been engaging with students and bringing students in, it's one of the things that I'm so careful of. And I think because I came into my undergrad and then even into my master's at a time when at McGill University, when I did my PhD in 2003, when I started there wasn't a single Indigenous faculty member on campus. And it's really sad, but I had to selectively choose which part of me I was presenting to campus that day. And I mean that, so in places where we see the honoring of Indigenous knowledge, the opening of space, connection and relationality, sharing of food and connection in that way, it's so beautiful, right? And I think that there's much more work to do. I really want to, we have a very beautiful slide next, because it's about Indigenous communities' right to refuse research. And I'm actually going to skip that slide because I want to get to the final slide, which is about embracing discomfort. Because I think one of the things that many people want to know, and I'm not sure how to say this, but I think I hear repeatedly, I don't know if I'm going to make a mistake. I sometimes I don't know what I don't know, and I'm very worried that I will misspeak, I may pronounce something wrong, or I'm not sure how to find readings for my course. I'm not sure how to engage in pedagogy that I'm not comfortable with. But being on this journey means that we're making space for new knowledge and perspectives. And I just would love all of our panelists maybe to have a chance to respond to this question. So I'm going to start with Dee and move to Victoria, if that's okay, and then we'll bring Heather and Isaac in.
So my response, Chantelle, is very simple and quick. Just ask. If you're uncomfortable, just ask. So that's it.
Okay, thank you very much. Words of wisdom. Victoria?
That is brilliant. That is brilliant, Dee, yes. I think it harkens back to the presentation by Heather and Isaac, in that we need to be conscious that Indigenous knowledges have been excluded and erased from these spaces, and that some of the knowledges Indigenous students, Indigenous faculties are going to bring into these conversations may be completely unfamiliar to geographers, to non-Indigenous geographers, and that we need to be conscious when new knowledges are presented to us, and that they challenge some of the assumptions as to what is truth and what some of the basic tenets to geography. that we're conscious and open to that new knowledge and not dismissive of it. If it's not in 10 high-level academic papers, it's not relevant to me, but being open to that new knowledge and looking for ways to connect it to ourselves and personally and also academically.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. I'd really love for us to hear from Isaac now. Isaac, I think you've been on like a pretty fascinating journey. Probably a lot of learning, coming into spaces that may be unfamiliar to you. And I wondered if you wanted to share maybe some of your experiences or thoughts about this idea.
Yeah, so the first thing I'll say is, and this comes from, I guess my research is that it takes time. It definitely takes time and it takes effort to do the work, to read, to learn, to listen to Indigenous scholars, Indigenous geographers, Black scholars, Black geographers. I think so embracing this discomfort is really about taking the time to understand that there are different knowledge systems and different ways of knowing and different ways of doing, different ways of living on the land. I think that what it really takes is that critical understanding to really embrace the complexity and the beauty of the multiple or the multifarious epistemologies and ontologies that exist. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Finally, Heather, would you like to contribute to this question?
Sure, it's such an important one. I think a few items, just to echo everything else I've heard. I think as a settler scholar, part of my responsibility in terms of responsibility with Indigenous knowledge holders is to amplify that scholarship, to use my place and privilege in the academy to recognize all of this important scholarship that's happening by Indigenous individuals in the academy and outside the academy. I think it's part of my responsibility to be a peer mentor to those who want to learn how to, so to not ask Dee about like, what can I do? You know, ask me, you know, because I've been working in this space for a long time. And I think that's part of my responsibility is to take on that and be able to share and do some peer mentorship. And it doesn't matter what stage of career you're at. Whether you're an undergrad in first year or, you know, a professor emeritus, right? We're all learners. If we're in the academy, we must love learning, right? And so I think the other part of that is to have humility and a sense of humor about your own weaknesses, your own inabilities in certain areas, and to recognize that in this space, we're not competitive, right? Like, when I think of all of the support that I've received through the Indigenous mentorship networks across this country, this is a space of collaboration and support. It's not a competitive environment. It's so unlike what we typically see in the academic milieu. And then finally, if this isn't for you, that's okay. It doesn't have to be for everyone, but don't block. Don't be a bystander. Support, but you don't have to engage all the time, but don't be a blocker or a bystander. And that's all I'll say there. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So we are at the place where we can take questions from the audience. And so I think what I'm going to do is just show this very quick, beautiful photo because it's my son, William. And William is standing on the spot where his placenta was buried. So when he was born, we kept his placenta in my freezer for close to a year before we were able to go up to Northern Ontario and put his placenta in the earth, put it back in the earth. And so I had to show this photo just to remind us about why we're doing this work, right? So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and bring us all together and ask if we have questions from the audience. We've gone through a lot of content, I think, and I know that the work is very emotional, right? I think we are in the way that Heather said that not everybody feels compelled to take a leadership role in this, and it doesn't have to be for everybody, but I think there are lots of ways to engage in it without being the face of the work. And so are there questions or thoughts, ideas? You can either, I think you can raise your hand, or if you want, you could put a question in the chat. Do any of the speakers have anything they want to say while we're waiting? Okay, so I see a question from Jenna. Thank you very much. So a wonderful panel. Thank you everyone for speaking. I've been doing a lot of thinking about equity and how to go about it. I'm curious how the panel feels about the sudden push towards EDI policies. Is it helpful or is it superficial? Who would like to? There's a lot of symbolism for sure. Go ahead, Heather.
Yeah, I'll just maybe speak from my experience. Just 1 sec. Hold on, George. For my experience at Queen's University, we really started to mobilize when George Floyd was brutally murdered by the police in the States. And a small core group of us came together and said, we need more than just a statement of support on our website. We need a statement that indicates our action, that say Black Lives Matter and people of color's lives matter. And how do Indigenous lives matter? How do we do that? And so we came up with a plan to say that for this coming year, we are going to have our speaker series will be all Black, Indigenous, and people of color scholars. That is our action that we can do right now to say we reject this kind of white supremacy and police brutality and violence. And so I think there's that piece, but then it formed into, we need a committee in our department that's a standing committee that always is bringing this to all of the other committees to think about equity, diversity, and inclusion and indigeneity. And so we mobilized and created a term of reference that has now been adopted into the department's constitution. But what the students did, and I think they took a lot of energy from what we were doing and said, that's great, we're going to do one more thing. And that is we're going to have 2 streams. And we're going to have an EDI committee, and we're going to have a decolonizing and indigenization committee. And the reason for doing so is that it's not a direct overlap map of the things that are going on. There are differences. And so to recognize and honor those differences and have parallel streams, but not that they're folded into one another because of that risk of it becoming watered down and literally whitewashed. So that's one way that we're kind of thinking that through, Jenna.
Would any of the other panelists like to address that question? I can see another question in the chat.
So
go ahead, Dave.
I would just say that the way that I look at equity, diversity, and inclusion right now is that it comes about as a reactive mode. And until we get to where it's a very proactive effort on the part of the university, it's still uncomfortable for us. And so I think about like walking around campus, there's still aggressions happening on campus that an equity, diversity, inclusion committee has not addressed because they're still trying to put out so many fires. So there's a lot of work to do. And I think having people aware that there's a lot of work to do advances that movement so much faster.
I think what I'm going to do is offer one last, Victoria or Isaac, would you like to respond to that question or add any other comments?
Just quickly to echo Heather and Dee's comments that Indigenous rights and Indigenous issues of equity are distinct and they require equitable resourcing and support, and that they're not landed onto staff and faculty already leading other different initiatives. We need to value the Indigenous or the work being done to address Indigenous equity issues.
Mm-hmm. Isaac?
We can move on to the final question for the sake of time, if that's.
I'm just noticing that it's 5:01 p.m. And with all due respect, I think I'm actually going to leave that question because it's time. It got dark outside. I thought it was dark earlier, but I think it was a big rain cloud that was sitting over our building, and then that passed, and now it's actually officially dark in Ontario. I want to really acknowledge Victoria and Diana, especially. I know that my two colleagues, with the push to do the work that's necessary, so much of it falls on their laps. And it's because we care so much. It's the reason that I cried when I showed the lake, because we do this work because it is a part of who we are. It's our families and it's our communities, and the work doesn't stop. It never stops. And so the fact that you've both come today to share so openly means a great deal. I also want to thank Heather and Isaac for sharing your work, and to say that the work before us requires many people, and it requires us to share our resources as broadly as we can, and to be brave, to say, I'm not an expert in this, but I'm going to come and carry the load because it is the right thing to do. Finally, I just want to thank CAGONT and my colleagues here at Western who have who agreed to host CAGONT this year. And I want to thank our audience. So I'm going to wish you all a great weekend, and say a very big miigwech nyawen to you all for a great panel. Thank you very much. We can all clap, virtually or in the real thing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chantelle. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a great weekend. Enjoy the rest of CAGONT.
Thank you.
Laliak.